The Incas Empire was located and developed in the east of South America, constituting a vast empire that includes the current countries of Peru, Bolivia, much of Ecuador, northern Argentina, and northern Chile. By 1532, their territory was expanded from the Pacific coast across the Andes to the Atlantic coast and from central Chile to Ecuador. Their capital was Cusco, which is located in Peru. Their empire was known as Tahuantinsuyo, which means Land of the Four Craters. They had an area of more than 9,100 square kilometers. Today, pieces of the Inca Empire remain in different areas of the central highlands of the Andes, for example, Machu Picchu. Quito, Lima, Cusco, Lake Titicaca, Tucumán, Santiago, and Constitution were the cities in where the Incas were nowadays located. Their names in the Incas' time used to be Chinasuyo, Antisuyo, Constitusuyo, and Collasuyo.
Social and political organization. Let's remember the Inca Empire was the largest empire that ever existed in South America. A well-organized structure and established rules were key for all of their success. Political organization. The Incas had a monarchical and theocratic government. Monarchical means that it was ruled by an absolute chief, king, or queen, and theocratic means that it was ruled by officials with a specific divine power. Laws prioritize work and punish thieves. Sapa Inca, highest authority. Tukuy Rikuy, secret agent and spy of the Inca. The Imperial Council, entity of 8 people that gave advice to the Sapa Inca. Suyuk, the governors of the 4 territories of the Inca Empire. Aki, the crown prince. Wilak Uma, the high priest. Hamawats, the sage who prepared the Inca elite. Abuskipai, the general of the imperial army. Social organization. Hierarchical and rigid. Hierarchical means that it was arranged in rank order, and rigid means that it was not easily changed. The empire had great differences between social classes. First, royalty. Inca royalty, nuclear family of the Sapa Inca. Aki, son, Koya, wife, and La Panaca Real, first-line relatives of the Inca. Second, nobility, blood nobility, other generations of the Panacas, and nobility of privilege, service people. Third, people. Alu Hatunruna, peasants in general, with mice, groups that colonize new people, Yanakoas, servants and prisoners. The upper class wore elaborated clothes and jewelry, had access to appropriate education, and had many privileges. The lower class could not attend to school. They lived in households, wore plain clothes, and had what was needed.
The Incas were polytheists, which means they believed in many gods. Most of their gods represented nature elements. The Incas believed that the hills and mountains were generators of people. This belief came thanks that mountains create rivers and springs. This fact led the Incas to believe that men came from the mountains and hills called Apus. The Incas believed in magical powers of objects and worship of nature and its ancestors. They made sacrifice of animals and people. Also, they offered textiles, coca, and corn. Also, in places called huecas, that were every place considered sacred. Sanctuaries, for example, they venerate, made sacrifice, and adored their gods. Their religion was present in every area of their lives. And as I said before, the Incas believed in many gods. So some of them were Viracocha. Incas said that he had come out from Lake Titicaca and had immediately made the sun and moon appear, and had ordered them to illuminate the world day and night. Inti or Punchao was a god who was considered the Incas' father. The moon or mother Quilla was considered the sun's wife, and they said she ruled fertility. Pachamama or Mother Nature. Incas thought, as her name said, that Pachamama created nature. Pachacamac was the god of fire. Incas believed that through telluric movements, Pachacamac gave life to earth and that he attributed the ability to provide food. Finally, Mother Sara. She was the mother of corn or food. Corn, along with coca and potatoes, were primordial foods for the Incas.
Rituals. Cannibalism. The Incas ate other humans as a symbol of sacrifice, warfare, and death. They believed that by eating a person you will gain their qualities. Exocannibalism was in revenge or to prove yourself. Endocannibalism was used to preserve the essence of a dead person. His or her bones were mixed up into a drink. Capacocho. Children of different provinces in the Inca Empire were trained. Once a year in Cusco, they were offered to different gods. The purpose of this ritual was to renew the bond between the provinces and to regain trust with their gods. Each month of the Inca calendar, that had 12 months of 30 days, had its own festival. The year started with the Capac Rei. Capac Rei. In summer, to honor the god of the sun, young men pierced their ears so that they could wear the spool's horn. Inti Raymi. In winter, the Incas prayed for the sun to return. A white llama was sacrificed. The 8-day feast. For the crops to grow properly, a chant to the sun to rise was sung, and burnt llamas were offered. The combing of the hair. In the ceremony in Cusco, only pretty young girls chose a new name and became brides or princesses of rulers. Important people were buried in chambers, but common people were buried in caves or graves. The deceased were mummified with important objects.
The Incas had a centrally planned economy, perhaps the most successful ever seen. Collective labor was the base for economic productivity and for the creation of social wealth in the They created such wealth that the Spanish were astonished with what they encountered. Every Inca was required to work. Refusal or laziness could be punished with the death penalty. Labor was divided according to region. Agriculture would be centralized in the most productive regions. Ceramic production, road building, and textiles were other examples. The government collected the tributes, and in exchange, citizens would receive free clothing, food, healthcare, and education. The Incas did not use money. Their economy was so efficiently planned that every citizen had their basic needs. Economic exchanges were made using the barter system, which consisted of trading goods. Archaeologists believed Incas often traded with small tribes from outside the empire. The Ayu was the center of the Incas' economic success. Ayus were composed of families that lived near each other in the same village. Each one specialized in the production of certain products depending on its location. Agricultural Ayus, for example, were located close to fertile land. Their output would be given to the state, which would be distributed to other locations where the product was not available. The use of land was a right that individuals had as members of the Ayu. The representative of the Ayu distributed the land to each member according to the size of their families. Each family worked their land, but they did not own it. There were three ways in which collective labor was organized. The first one was the Aini, which was to help a member of the community who was in need. The second one was the Minca, or teamwork for the benefit of the whole community. The third one was the Mita, or the tax paid to the Inca. This system was a balanced system of give and take. In exchange, the government would provide food, clothing, and medication. This system allowed the empire to have all the necessary produce available for redistribution according to necessity and local.
Art. The Incas were practical and used natural resources to create art. It expressed everyday life and was used as religious offerings. They adapted what they knew and believed with their needs. Some ways of art were vases and plates, altars of solid gold, jewelry, potteries, and tumis, that were knives used for sacrificing animals. The upper bowl is very important because it stored maize, chicha, and other dishes and liquids. Craftsmen from the Ilus produced potteries and did weavings of textiles. The artisans worked in jewelry and clothing for the nobility, but most of it was looted by the Spanish conquerors. Gold was abundant, and the Incas wore it constantly or used it as a decoration. It was a measure of social status. The Incas did not have written records of their history. Stories were passed orally, and nowadays we understand them with archaeological objects. Inca's architecture was successful due to the social organization. The Ilus and Mites did the intensive work of the huge monuments, and the strongest men built temples for the Inca gods. Inca's textile is considered one of the greatest textiles on earth. They used cotton, alpacas, llamas, vicuñas, and guanacos wool. Clothes made of vicuñas and guanacos wool were exclusively for the nobility. The Inca pottery did not portray the human form. It was used with geometric patterns, colors, and heads of animals. They used natural clay, sand, rock, and shale. Pottery was not only art, but also a way to store food. Wind and percussion were the only two musical instruments that the Incas had. Their music was based in a pentatonic. It only used 5 notes, but later the Spanish brought more. Art was key for the development of the Inca Empire because all social classes had access to it in different ways, in music, dances, architecture, weaving, in between many more.
The Inca Empire didn't have a lot of basic technologies. They didn't use the wheel for transport, they didn't have a writing system, and they didn't have iron for making tools. They built a large system of roads that went throughout the empire, which were usually paved with stone. The main purpose of the roads was for communication, moving army troops, and to transport goods. Commoners weren't allowed to travel on the roads. Stone steps were often built on steep areas in the mountains, and bridges where the roads needed to cross rivers. The Inca built a variety of bridges, including suspension bridges and pontoon bridges. Communication was accomplished by runners on the roads. These were fast young men called chasquis, who would run from one relay station to the next. At each station they would pass the message to the next chasqui. Messages were either passed verbally or by using a quipu. Messages traveled quickly this way at a rate of around 250 miles per day. The runners were punished harshly if the message was not accurately delivered. This rarely happened. A quipu was a series of strings with knots. The number, size, and distance between the knots conveyed a meaning to the Incas, sort of like writing. Only specially trained officials knew how to use them. The Inca were expert farmers. They used irrigation and water storage techniques to grow crops in all sorts of terrain from the deserts to the high mountains. Despite not having beasts of burden or iron tools, the Inca farmers were very efficient. They used agricultural terraces, as seen in the image. The Inca used the calendar to mark religious festivals as well as the seasons so they could plant their crops at the correct time of the year. They studied the sun and the stars to calculate their calendar. The calendar was made up of 12 months, which had 3 weeks of 10 days each. When the calendar and the sun don't match, they would add a day or two to bring them back to alignment. One of the main forms of medicine used by the Inca was the coca leaf, and they were the first people to use brain surgery on others successfully. The basic unit of distance used by the Inca was one pace or a taza.
Such as many other ancient and nowadays civilizations, had strange and for us the Incas, such as many other ancient and nowadays civilizations, had strange and for us abnormal customs. Some of them were: the Incas loved the beauty of the deformed cranium. Whenever a child was born, they would tightly grab the child's head with bandages, creating pressure points on the different parts of the cranium. This limited the cranium growth on a particular part. Also, the Incas practiced the strange and painful custom of making holes in the craniums of living people for healing deep injuries and other ailments on the head. Another custom was that the Incas practiced cannibalism, so this was realistic. They believed that they would inherit the powers of the person by consuming their muscles. As we already know, the Incas had several gods. The most important for them was the sun god and his wife, the moon goddess. The Incas believed that in the absence of the sun god, his wife takes over his duties. So they thought that when it was the day, it's because, well, the sun god was working. And when it was night, it's because, well, the sun had like to sleep. So the moon will come and replace him. Okay, so these were some of the Incas customs.
The Inca Empire ran from around 1200 when the first Inca, Marco Capac, settled in Cusco until 1533 when the last Inca, Atahualpa, was executed. It is believed that in 10 years between 50% and 90% of the population contracted diseases such as smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, and many more. In 1527 the civil war was triggered by the death of the Sapa Inca and his eldest son, who was supposed to be the heir to the throne. According to tradition, Huáscar was the next in line, but Atahualpa, his half-brother, was considered a more capable warrior, but he didn't have legitimacy to the throne. The civil war ended in 1532 with Atahualpa as the victor. The conquest started in 1532 with a group led by Francisco Pizarro arrived in the city of Cajamarca. Atahualpa's actions led to his capture, the death of many Inca soldiers, and, on August 29 of 1533, to his execution. In 1536, Manco Inca, after a failed attempt to conquer Cusco, retreated to the mountains of Vilcamba, where he created a neo-Inca government which lasted for 36 years. Basically, an adaptation of the Inca Empire survived for 4 decades, but the original Inca Empire died.